Welcome to Eco Radio. I'm Bob Grove, your host. Tonight, we're going to talk about overpopulation. There are now 7.8 billion people living on this planet with the potential of doubling to 15.6 billion in the next 80 years. This growing population increases the volume of greenhouse gas emissions, air and water pollution, solid waste and landfills, and increases demand on our food and energy systems. We're joined tonight by Alan Weisman, David Hakin, Jack Alpert, and Victor Dhougherty. Alan Weisman is a journalist and author who has worked in nearly 60 countries on all 7 continents. His 2007 international bestseller, The World Without Us, is now in 35 languages, and his most recent book, Countdown, won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. David Hakin is the co-founder of the Kansas City Drawdown Society, a retired science teacher and a touring songwriter. Jack Alpert is the director of the Stanford Knowledge Integration Lab, whose research ranges from how people gather and process information to the relationship between human cognition and civilization viability. They are currently focused on discovering and implementing behavior that changes our course and creates a sustainable civilization. And Victor Dhougherty is the director of the Temple Buddhist Center in Kansas City, Missouri, and has been practicing for over 18 years. Victor is a retired public education and remains active in the community around social and environmental issues. So let's start with population growth. The 3 largest countries in the world are China, India, and the United States. China and India both have about 1.4 billion people, or 18% of the world's population each. And the United States comes in third with 330 million people, or 4% of the world population. Population is declining in all 3 of these countries. The United Nations reports that growth rates in India are down to 1.1%, the United States is down to 0.7%, and China's growth rate is down to 0.39%. But is that enough? Let's start with Alan Weisman. Alan, can you talk to us about overpopulation?
Well, in nature, every species puts out lots of copies of itself when it reproduces because they tend to die just as fast as new youngins are born. So all those extra copies take care of that infant mortality. And humanity is no different. We used to die off as fast as we were being born, but then starting with a smallpox vaccine about 200 years ago, we started cheating the Grim Reaper. And then we learned ways to grow more food than nature had ever possibly been able to grow on this planet. And so to cut to the chase, in a single century, the last one, our population quadrupled. No other major species has done anything like that. And now, ecologically speaking, there's about 6 and 7 times as many of us on this planet as there ought to be. That's the chief reason why we're putting so much stress on the atmosphere, because we're all addicted to energy. And it's the chief reason that we're pushing so many other species off the edge of this planet, because we're all addicted to food, and half the planet is now devoted to growing food for one species, ourselves. So yeah, that sounds like too much to me. And nature is letting us know every which way that it's not going to tolerate this for much longer.
David.
Project Drawdown did the math and rated the top climate solutions. And they found that educating girls ended up number 5 out of the top 80 solutions. And this is from the UN data that shows that on average, if a girl does not get an education, average family size is 5+ children. And if she receives an education, the average is only 2 children. And when levels of education rise, in particular for girls and young women, access to reproductive health care improves, the women's political, social, and economic empowerment expand, fertility typically falls, they put more resources into fewer children. And across the world and over time, this impacts the world's population. And it is estimated by UNESCO that there are 30 million elementary age girls and 34 million high school age girls worldwide who are denied education. So this becomes a very powerful lever for over the next 30 years, with the potential of decreasing the world's population by 1 billion people, which would really put us to where reversing global warming would be in our reach.
Jack, what kind of work are you doing with overpopulation?
Well, I'm the numbers guy. I'm an engineer. To me, overpopulation is a number. It's the number of people who are going to be injured. And any solution that we come up with is a decrease in that number. So do you have a number for how many people will die of starvation and conflict in the next 80 years? If you don't have a number, then it's zero and you don't worry about it. And if you do have a number, you can have two numbers: the number of people who will die of starvation and conflict in the next 80 years from overpopulation. And then you can talk about each behavior that you can imagine. You can answer the question, how does that number change? How much does that number reduce by this alternative behavior? Now, my research suggests that if we had zero population growth, that we wouldn't change that number. I don't want to shock you, but my number for the number of starvation and conflict deaths between now and 2100 is 8 to 10 billion people. That's more than are alive today. It's almost everybody. And if I could snap my fingers and have zero population growth, my number doesn't go down. That the thing that would cause starvation and conflict deaths has to do with declining supporting resources, not with population growth. So that's how I put population growth into context to overpopulation.
Victor, you represent faith-based communities. What's your take on overpopulation?
Thank you, Bob. And I also want to acknowledge the other members of the panel. There's some just a wealth of information and knowledge has been compiled just sitting right here. Obviously, as representing the Buddhist tradition, I can speak primarily to that. We all are very well aware of a lot of the other traditions and how they approach birth control, how they approach, all these different types of things. And sometimes they are in direct contrast to everything that science is telling us. So from the Buddhist perspective right now, there is a naturalness to what is happening. And I refer back to what Alan was saying. Normally in nature, overpopulation is taken care of by predators, by disease, by famine, war, homosexuality. Malthus was very clear in all of his teachings. And so there's a naturalness to it. And so from the Buddhist perspective, there is a naturalness to what's happening. So Eckhart Tolle tells us that what the world needs right now is not more knowledge. What it needs is wisdom. And so the idea here is that we keep coming up with really great ideas. For example, wearing a mask. Science can empirically, the best videos, anything you can imagine can show you that wearing a mask will prevent spread of a disease or even receiving it. And yet, 72, 80 million people in America alone, not counting the world, are like, don't get it. They don't see it. So I'm afraid kind of what I'm saying, and to back up Jack a little bit on this, is that this could be very painful. So let me give you an example. In the Buddhist practice, wisdom is accrued through experience, not through somebody telling me something. In other words, it's like me trying to tell you all what my mother's cooking tastes like. It's not possible. You have to experience it. And so this same rule kind of applies. As a species, we're going to have to experience this before we really get it. And that's a very painful, a very not very happy looking forecast. And so what's going to happen is we're going to have to really, experience a lot of death and famine and disease to realize that, oh, wait a minute, we're stewards of the planet, we're caretakers of the world, and that includes how we hold that. And that applies to population and reproduction and being responsible. So, I'm kind of, in the Buddhist practice, the Dalai Lama was asked, if science disproves something in the Buddhist practice, which would you go with? And he says, well, science, of course. Why cling to something that's not able to be proven?
Thanks, Victor. I'm Bob Grove, and we're talking about overpopulation. When we return, we'll discuss population control.